Alright, AP Human Geography classes, here's our second video on development, and we're going to focus on where are MDCs and LDCs distributed. Let's get to it. Let's first look at this map real quick. This should look familiar. Just real quick, look at it, study it, notice the red line. Alright, let's talk about it. So, this is dubbed the north-south split, or also known as the Brant line. If you were to draw a line through the 30-degree latitude line across the world, you would notice one big thing, that nearly all MDCs are located above this line with the exception of the Oceania region, and then all LDCs are located beneath this line. And what this line clearly depicts is if a brick wall was put up that would separate MDCs from LDCs, all right? It depicts a world divided. And we know we've talked much about HDI, the Human Development Index, and where countries lie, and we've discussed how they are analyzed within that number. Well, we're going to talk about regions and compare HDI scores. Let's get to it. All right, let's talk about North America first, with one of the highest HDI scores at 0.095. And there's two big reasons. So economically, the North America region, which by the way does not include Mexico in this HDI score, is a leading consumer of goods and has the highest level of tertiary jobs in the following fields: healthcare, leisure, like sports, let's say, and finance fields. We're also the largest food exporter, believe it or not. And on a social factor, people are living, let's say, longer because we have the largest number of healthcare providers as well. Let's jump to Europe. I do need to note that Southern and Eastern European countries lag in the level of development as, let's say, Central and Western countries, and thus drag the score of the HDI down for the entirety of Europe. If we were to split these, we would see two very drastic differences. 15 of the 19 highest HDIs are located in Europe, right? Some countries such as Sweden, Germany, Norway. Now, on an economic scale, we talked about the European Union and how it helped erase many borders. What also helped erase economic barriers, and it's easy for transportation and communication to flow from country to country. Now, Europe is also heavily reliant on international trade, and they produce a number of high-value goods, such as cars. And for example, we have BMW and Mercedes-Benz as examples. All right, let's talk about Russia. Russia has a very low HDI score. At one time a superpower and is still considered one of the largest economies in the world. So what happened was there was a transition period between the Soviet Union back to Russia, which greatly hurt its economy. It flipped the way it thought about its economy. And so unemployment soared, the standard of living decreased, and HDI went from 0.9 in the 90s to below 0.8 after 2000. Now, they are slowly recovering that number, all right, and it's due to the escalating production of oil. Maybe 5 or 10 years from now, their HDI score could be above 8.8. All right, now let's focus on Japan, which as a country has one of the highest HDI scores. Now, economically speaking, how did this happen? Well, workers were paid very low wages to begin with in the early developmental period of this country. Now, they produced goods to sell to foreign markets that were almost always lower than domestic goods, hence people would buy those goods over domestic. They eventually switched over to high quality and high value products such as electronics, cars, and cameras, and thus it is the reason why they have the third largest economy. Part of the reason is that they spend twice as much on research and development than the United States. And on a social aspect, they have one of the best educational systems in the world, as well as one of the best training programs for workers across the world. Let's focus on the Oceania region, which is a HDI score of 0.90. The largest contributors in this area are Australia and New Zealand, with a plethora of other islands located within this area. Economically speaking, they are actually just a small contribution overall on a global scale, yet they lead the world in mining important minerals such as iron ore, lead, and nickel. All right, focus on Latin America, which now Mexico is included in this HDI score. I do need to note that urban areas within Latin America have a development level more closely rated to MDCs versus rural areas which have a development level more closely related to LDCs. Economically speaking, if you look here, right, population-wise, their coastal area has a higher population and thus a higher GDP per capita than, say, in other areas throughout Latin America. Now, these regions suffer from inequitable income distribution, meaning that the reason why people are located on the coast is because there's jobs and there's better paying jobs versus, let's say, the center or the heart of Latin America. On the social aspect, and I just said it before, population is heavily concentrated on the coast, and most people in Latin America live in urban areas. All right, let's jump now to East Asia, and the main driving force behind the HDI score in East Asia is China. Now, China is the second largest economy and currently the largest manufacturing country in the world. Now, wages are paid to workers here that are much lower than MDCs, and hence they are now focused more on manufacturing. Now, tertiary jobs are lacking for this economy to grow, which we know the United States has a ton of tertiary jobs. On a social aspect, China is the most populous country, and unfortunately, it produces the greatest levels of world pollution. Let's focus on Southwest Asia and North Africa, as they are very similar and thus grouped together. Much of the area in both of these regions are surrounded by desert. However, both these regions contain the largest concentration of oil reserves in the world as of right now. Now, on an economic scale, there's a large per capita income gap between oil-rich countries and those lacking. So, for example, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are large oil-rich countries versus Jordan and Syria, which are not, and thus there is a great gap in income levels between these countries. On a social aspect, 95% of the region is dominated by Islam, and this usually conflicts with Western business practices because many shops close or halt business during prayer time, right? Obviously, 90% of the region is dominated by Islam. Why wouldn't you? Also, why the Human Development Index score is lower is because women are excluded from holding various job positions, and women have very low levels of literacy versus other areas. On a demographic scale, what hinders these areas is terrorism and internal wars, such as the war between Iran and Iraq over the annexation of Kuwait. All right, let's jump now to Southeast Asia with an HDI score of 0.73. Now, this includes the islands of Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines. Now, unfortunately, this area is hindered by a ton of developmental factors such as mountain ranges, intense heat, abundant rainfall, typhoons, and tsunamis. They have to deal with a lot. Now, the main island, Java, is the most populous island due to its fertile soil. And economically speaking, this area harvests goods that are used for manufacturing, such as palm oil and coconut oil, and they are known for producing cheap clothing and textiles. All right, now let's go to Central Asia, which the highest levels of development can be found in Kazakhstan and Iran. Also, it is good to note that the highest concentration of oil reserves are also in these two countries, hence their level of development. On an economic scale, all of these countries, minerals and agricultural products constitute the majority of GDP. All right, South Asia, which includes India and Pakistan. This area has the second highest population with the second lowest per capita income, right? So there's a ton of people that don't have a lot of money. So economically speaking, there's not even enough resources to support the rising population. And this area is heavily reliant, agriculturally speaking, on monsoon rains. Now, India, to note, is the fourth largest economy, which manufactures goods like peanuts, rice, wheat, and iron ore. And they also now have tons of tertiary jobs that are outsourced because you can pay these workers lower wages than, let's say, in other MDCs. On the social aspect, the population density in this area is very high, and the natural increase rate is the second highest in the world, right? There are a ton of people being born, and the economy just can't sustain the increasing growth rates. All right, so the lowest HDI score as a region is Sub-Saharan Africa, which includes all countries south of the Sahara. This is important to note. One of the problems are landlocked countries, which we've discussed before, and they have issues when exporting goods to other areas such as Europe. Now, economically speaking, this area is extremely important for sources of minerals such as diamonds and platinum. But the per capita income, what people make per household, is the worst in all of the world, and it's even worse today than it was 20 and 30 years ago. There's not enough resources, there's not enough land to sustain this growing population, which has the highest NIR in the world. People are being born and they cannot sustain them. Socially speaking, this is the highest level also of people living in poverty with the lowest levels of education. And as we learned before, those two together, just not a good mix. Now, demographically speaking, this area also suffers from internal conflicts of war, which drives down life expectancy and infant mortality rates. Okay, I know that was a lot. We analyzed the HDI by regions, and we talked about each region and why they have that score. All right, we're going to talk much more about this, and we're going to look at the statistics today, not back in 2009 when they were taken. All right, talk about it more in class. See you then.